The pregnant young woman was on her knees in the middle of the crowd. But what she received was not sympathy, but a painful slap across the face. "Useless, you're pregnant and still think you can cling to my son." The wealthy woman standing before her cursed at her and slapped her again. Grace held her pregnant belly as tears streamed down her reddened face. She wanted to explain, but no one was willing to listen. Her boyfriend, the man she had once loved, was standing right there, and instead of protecting her, he coldly said, "I don't want this child. You're on your own." Those words shattered the woman carrying his child inside her. She was abandoned when she had nothing left. No money, no family, no one willing to stand by her. But across the city, another powerful man was living through a completely different tragedy. Nathaniel Calder had money, power, and an empire that made everyone fear him. But he had spent his entire life searching for a little sister his family believed had died as a baby. Two complete strangers. One was being trampled on by the entire world. The other had everything, except his family. And then fate brought them together. Nathaniel looked at the pregnant woman, trying to hide her tears, and said something that left her speechless. "If no one else needs you, let me protect you and your baby." But he had no idea. The woman he had just saved from despair was the missing sister he had been searching for more than 20 years. And when the two halves of the pendant were placed together, a truth that would finally make them both cry was revealed. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. Everybody knows what he really is under that nice suit. You can't wash off where you came from, Calder. Some of us still remember you sleeping in your truck behind the diner on Leavenworth Street. The words landed in the middle of a crowded charity luncheon at the Magnolia Room, tossed carelessly across a table by a red-faced real estate broker named Curtis Boyle, who did not know or did not care that the man standing 3 feet behind him, quietly refilling his water glass at the drink station, was Nathaniel Calder himself. Nate did not turn around. He simply stood there, the pitcher of ice water trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand, while 40 years fell away in the space of one sentence. He was 7 years old again, standing outside a diner window on a night so cold. His breath froze on the glass, watching other families eat, while his mother told him gently that they would eat tomorrow. He remembered the particular ache of hunger that was not loud, not dramatic, just a low and constant hum beneath every thought. He remembered the truck. He remembered being ashamed of remembering it. Around him, the room laughed at something else entirely oblivious. Nate set the pitcher down, steadied his hands, and walked back toward his table, with the same unhurried, unreadable calm that had made grown businessmen nervous across a negotiating table for 20 years. Only his eyes, for one unguarded second, betrayed something older and rawer than composure. Something that looked almost like grief. He said nothing to Boyle. He never did. Men like Boyle mistook silence for weakness, the same way they mistook wealth for a clean slate. Nate had learned long ago that the story people told about him, self-made, generous, a little mysterious, was only the surface. Underneath it lived another Nathaniel Calder entirely. One that the city of Omaha would never see in daylight. One that his late uncle had handed to him, along with a set of keys and a warning some inheritances cannot be refused. He left the luncheon early. Outside the October, wind cut across the parking lot, and for a moment he simply stood beside his car, letting the cold bite at his face the way it used to, when there had been no car, no coat, nothing but a boy and his mother and a bus stop bench that passed for shelter. He touched without quite meaning to the small silver pendant hidden beneath his shirt, half of a broken heart cold against his skin. He did not know, could not have known, that its other half was at that very moment resting in a wooden box in a house he had never visited, in the hands of a woman he had never met. Across town, in the wealthy, tree-lined stretch of Omaha known as Fairhaven Hills, morning arrived the way it always did in the Whitmore house, with the sound of Vivian Whitmore's voice rising before the sun had fully cleared the question. Rooftops. Grace. Grace. It is nearly 6:30, and the kitchen floor is still filthy. Do you understand what I pay you for? Or does none of that register with people like you? Grace Bennett straightened from where she had been kneeling, one hand pressed instinctively to the small round curve of her belly, the other still holding the damp rag she had been using to scrub a floor that to any reasonable eye was already spotless. She was 7 months along, and every morning now came with the same dull ache low in her back, the same exhaustion that sleep never seemed to touch. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll finish right now." "You'll finish now, and then you'll iron Chelsea's cream blouse for her luncheon, and then you'll air out the guest room before the Prestons arrive at noon. I don't pay you to move like a woman twice your age." "Yes, ma'am." Grace lowered her eyes the way she had learned to do 2 years ago, the way that made the sharp words slide off instead of cutting in. It was a small, private trick of survival she had discovered, that if she looked at the floor instead of at Vivian Whitmore's face, she could absorb almost anything and still walk away standing. She thought of her son, not yet born, not yet named, but already the reason she swallowed insults the way other people swallowed coffee, bitter necessary. First thing in the morning. She had grown up not far from here in a modest house with a woman named Martha Bennett, a widow who had raised her with more love than money, who had worked double shifts at a laundromat, and never once in 23 years let Grace go. Hungry. Grace did not remember a father. She did not remember, if she was honest, very much, before the age of 4 at all. Only a persistent, wordless feeling, one she had never spoken aloud to anyone, that somewhere behind her earliest memories there was a sound she couldn't place. A second cry, small and thin, layered beneath her own. She pushed the thought away the way she always did, and carried the ironing board into the sunroom. Careful with the crease this time, came a new voice, younger, sharper. Chelsea Whitmore stood in the doorway in a silk robe, scrolling through her phone without looking up. "Last time you ruined my sleeve and I had to explain to everyone why I looked like I'd slept in my clothes. I'll be careful, Miss Whitmore. See that you are. I don't know why Mom keeps you on honestly with your situation." Chelsea's eyes flicked briefly pointedly to Grace's belly, then back to her phone as if the sentence needed no ending. Grace said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not cost her more than her pride was worth. Down in the kitchen, the only warmth in the house waited for her in the shape of Daisy Kowalski, a fellow housekeeper with a quick laugh and quicker hands, already setting out 2 mugs of coffee, 1 regular, 1 decaf, because Daisy remembered things like that. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't. Baby had other plans. Won't be long now." Daisy squeezed her shoulder, and for a moment the kitchen felt almost like a kind of home. "You're stronger than any of them in this house, you know that. All that money, and not one of them could survive a single day in your shoes. Some days I don't feel very strong. That's exactly when you are Gracie. Nobody feels strong while they're being strong. They just do it anyway." Grace almost smiled. It was she would think much later. One of the last mornings she would trust that voice without reservation. One of the last mornings before everything she thought she understood about loyalty, about family, about who she was and where she came from came apart at the seams and had to be built again from nothing. But that morning she only drank her coffee, felt her son shift beneath her ribs, and told herself, as she had told herself every morning for 2 years, "This is not the end of my story. It cannot be." Outside, unseen and unknown to her, in a city of nearly 500,000 people, a billionaire stood in a cold parking lot with his hand pressed to a broken piece of silver, carrying a grief he had never spoken aloud either, and neither of them yet understood how soon their 2 solitudes were about to collide. The scream came just after 10 in the morning, sharp enough to send a china cup clattering off its saucer in the breakfast room. Mom, come quick. Someone's taken my necklace." Grace was in the hallway with an armful of fresh linens when Chelsea Whitmore's voice tore through the house. She froze for half a second, the way anyone would at the sound of real panic, and then hurried toward the master suite, her heart already tightening with a feeling she could not yet name. Chelsea stood in the middle of her room, her jewelry box overturned on the dresser, her hands pressed to her mouth. "It's gone. The diamond necklace. Dad gave it to me for my birthday. It's gone." Vivian Whitmore arrived seconds later in a silk robe, her face draining of color as she surveyed the scattered contents of the box. A scatter of rings and bracelets. Everything present except the one piece that mattered. "When did you last see it? Last night. I took it off before bed and put it right here." Chelsea's voice cracked somewhere between grief and fury. "It's worth more than $80,000. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, the linen still in her arms, and felt the air in the room shift the way it does before a storm, that particular stillness that precedes something irreversible. "Who was in this room last night?" Vivian's eyes swept the hallway and landed inevitably on Grace. "I brought up the laundry, ma'am. That's all. I never touched the jewelry box. But you were in here. For less than a minute. I set the clothes on the chair and left." "That's convenient," Vivian said, and the word landed like a slap. Word spread through the house within the hour, the way bad news always did, fast, and distorted a little more with every telling. By the time Warren Whitmore came home from his office, the story had already hardened into something close to fact: the pregnant housekeeper alone in the room, and now a necklace worth a small fortune simply gone. "Let's not be hasty," Warren said, though. His eyes, when they landed on Grace, carried none of the reassurance his words implied. "Has the room been searched properly? These things fall behind furniture." "This is exactly the problem," Vivian snapped. "You always find a reason to defend her." She turned toward the kitchen, where Daisy stood half hidden behind the doorframe, wiping down a countertop that did not need wiping. "Daisy, you work beside her every day. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Daisy's eyes flicked to Grace, then away, then back to Vivian. For one long second, nobody in the room breathed. "I don't want to say anything that isn't fair to Grace," Daisy said slowly. "But last night I passed by Miss Chelsea's room and I saw Grace standing near the dresser. She had something small in her hand. When she saw me, she put it down fast and acted like nothing happened. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought maybe she was just looking at it." "Daisy," Grace's voice came out thin, disbelieving. "That's not what happened. I was collecting laundry. You know that. I'm sorry, Grace. I have to tell the truth." The room seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. She would think later that this was the exact moment the ground first opened beneath her. Not the handcuffs, not the police car, but this. Watching the one person in that house who had ever poured her a cup of decaf coffee without being asked, choosing in front of everyone to hand her over. "So it's settled," Vivian said, her voice hardening into something almost triumphant. "After everything this family has given you, the roof over your head, a paycheck every single week, despite your condition, this is how you repay us. I swear to you, Mrs. Whitmore, I did not take that necklace. Don't you dare stand in my house and swear to me with a thief's mouth." Vivian's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Vivian, wait." Warren stepped forward, one last flicker of hesitation crossing his face. "Maybe we search her quarters first before we number call them now. Let it be a lesson to every other girl who thinks she can take advantage of a family that's shown her kindness." Grace felt her son shift inside her, a small, insistent movement, as though he too understood that something was going terribly wrong. She pressed a hand flat against her belly and forced her voice steady. "Please, search my room. Search anywhere you want. You'll find nothing because I didn't do this." Nobody searched anything. 22 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into the circular driveway of the Whitmore estate, its lights washing blue and red across the manicured hedges, and a young officer stepped out to find a pregnant woman standing very still on the porch, her hands already folded in front of her, as though she had rehearsed somewhere deep inside herself exactly how this moment would go. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." "I'm 7 months pregnant," Grace said quietly. It was not a plea. It was simply a fact offered because she did not know what else to offer. "I understand, ma'am. I'll be careful." The cuffs closed with a soft metallic click that felt to Grace louder than anything she had ever heard in her life. Behind her, through the open front door, she caught one last glimpse of Daisy standing at the top of the stairs, arms wrapped around herself, refusing to meet her eyes. Chelsea had already turned away, scrolling through her phone as though the matter were closed. Only Warren Whitmore stood watching the patrol car pull away, his expression unreadable, something working behind his eyes that looked, if anyone had cared to look closely, less like satisfaction and more like a private, calculated relief. At the county jail, Grace sat on the edge of a thin mattress in a holding cell, her wrists raw where the cuffs had pressed too tight, and let herself for the first time that day cry, not loudly, not for long, just enough to release some of the pressure building behind her ribs before she wiped her face and made herself stop. She thought of Martha Bennett, the woman who had raised her, who had once told her that hard seasons come to everyone, and the measure of a person is not whether they suffer, but whether suffering makes them cruel. "I will not let this make me cruel," Grace told herself, resting both hands on her belly. "Whatever happens next, I will not let this be the thing that breaks me." 2 cells down, an older woman muttered something about how nobody in that building had ever actually done what they were accused of. Grace almost laughed, a short, broken sound, more grief than humor. She did not know, sitting there in the fluorescent hum of that county holding cell, that less than 2 miles away in a glass office on the 14th floor of a building bearing his own name, a man named Nathaniel Calder had just received a short, unremarkable message from a contact inside the Omaha Police Department, a routine flag on an arrest at the Whitmore residence, nothing more than a name and an address that meant nothing to him yet. He read it once. He almost set it aside. Then, for reasons he could not have explained, even to himself, he read it again. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Grace Bennett had been moved from the holding cell to a small interview room with a metal table bolted to the floor, and a window too high and too narrow to let in more than a strip of gray light. She sat with her hands folded over her belly, watching that strip of light shift slowly across the wall, and tried not to think about how many hours had passed since anyone had last spoken to her with kindness. The door opened. A young woman stepped in carrying a battered leather folder, her coat still damp from the morning drizzle, her eyes sharp and unhurried in a way that made Grace sit up a little straighter. "Grace Bennett, I'm Emily Hart. I've been assigned as your public defender. I can't pay for a lawyer." "You don't need to. That's the whole idea." Emily set the folder down and pulled out the single chair across the table, studying Grace for a long moment before she spoke again. "I've read the arrest report. I want to hear it from you in your own words before I read one more line of what they wrote about you." So Grace told her the necklace, the laundry, Daisy's face at the top of the stairs, the way nobody had searched a single drawer before calling the police. Emily listened without interrupting, jotting the occasional note, her expression unreadable, until Grace reached the end and fell silent. "There's no physical evidence," Emily said finally, half to herself, flipping back through her folder. "No necklace recovered. No search of the premises. One witness, and that witness's statement reads like it was rehearsed a little too well." She looked up. "In my experience, Grace, when a story is this convenient, it usually isn't true. Nobody else seems to think that. I'm not nobody else." Emily closed the folder with a soft, decisive click. "I grew up watching my father work cases where the easy answer was wrong more often than it was right. I don't like easy answers." For the first time in almost a full day, something in Grace's chest loosened just slightly. Not hope, not yet, but the faint, unfamiliar sensation of being believed. Across the city, in an office that occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower bearing his family's name, Nathaniel Calder read the message a third time. "Arrest flagged Whitmore residence, Fairhaven Hills. Female employee, pregnant, theft charge. No physical evidence recovered." It was nothing, really. A small item buried inside the Daily Digest his people compiled on anyone connected to Warren Whitmore, a habit Nate had maintained for 11 years, ever since he'd first understood that Whitmore Holdings had a way of growing that never quite added up. Most days, the Digest told him nothing worth remembering. This morning, for reasons he could not name, he found himself unable to look away from 4 words: pregnant, theft, charge, no evidence. He thought of his mother briefly, the way he always did when injustice crossed his desk in miniature. He thought of a winter years ago of being 9 years old, and watching a grocery store manager accuse her of shoplifting a loaf of bread she had in fact paid for with the last of their coins. The humiliation on her face, the way she had apologized anyway because arguing cost something people without money could never afford to spend. "Petey." Nate's voice carried easily across the open floor to the adjoining office where Peter Vance sat hunched over 3 monitors, a cane resting against his desk from an old injury that had never fully healed. Petey appeared in the doorway a moment later. Eyebrows already raised in mild suspicion, a look Nate had come to recognize as Petey's default response to almost anything involving another human being's problems. "What now?" "I need you to look into something." Quietly. Define quietly. Quietly, like nobody at the department, nobody at Whitmore Holdings, and definitely nobody in this building ever hears your name attached to it. Petey folded his arms. "That's not quiet, Nate. That's a ghost. What am I looking into?" Nate turned his laptop screen so Petey could see it. "A woman named Grace Bennett. Housekeeper for the Whitmores. Arrested yesterday for theft. No evidence. And this concerns us. How exactly?" "It concerns Whitmore." Nate leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening in the particular way it did whenever that name came up. "Anything that happens in that house is worth understanding. You know that as well as I do." Petey studied him a moment longer, something skeptical still working behind his eyes, but he nodded once and disappeared back toward his monitors without another word. He had learned over almost 20 years of friendship that when Nate's voice dropped into that low, deliberate register, arguing accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. It took Petey the better part of a day to find the thread worth pulling, and when he found it, he brought it to Nate's office without bothering to knock. Her boyfriend Petey said, dropping a printout on the desk, "Guy named Jake Everett. Left town 2 days before her arrest. No note, no forwarding address, nothing except this." Nate picked up the paper. A bank transfer record routed through a shell company called Meridian Consulting Partners, LLC, $30,000, deposited into Jake Everett's account 4 days before he disappeared. "Meridian Consulting doesn't consult on anything," Petey continued. "It's a shell. Filed in Delaware, 1 listed officer, no employees, no website. I ran the ownership chain back 3 layers before it dead-ended in a trust, but the trust's registered agent shares an address with 2 other shells that funnel legal fees to Whitmore Holdings." Nate sat very still, the printout balanced between 2 fingers, feeling something cold settle into his chest. that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was paid to leave her, Nate said quietly. Looks that way. While she was pregnant, while she had no one. Nate. Petey's voice carried a note of caution, the same note it had carried 100 times before, whenever he sensed Nate leaning toward a decision that would cost more than it appeared to. I know what you're thinking, and I'm going to ask you not to. I haven't said anything yet. You don't have to. I've known you since we were both eating cereal for dinner because it was cheaper than anything else in the cupboard. I know exactly what that face means. Petey leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. This isn't our fight. Whatever Whitmore's doing to some housekeeper isn't a business problem. It's not a family problem. It's not our problem at all. And getting involved means exposing exactly the kind of attention neither of us can afford. A woman is sitting in a cell right now for something she didn't do. A lot of people are sitting in cells for things they didn't do, Nate. You can't save all of them. I'm not trying to save all of them. Nate set the printout down carefully as if it weighed more than paper had any right to weigh. I'm trying to understand why a man like Warren Whitmore would spend $30,000 to make sure one pregnant woman had nobody left to believe her. Petey opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally sighed the particular sigh of a man who has already lost an argument he hasn't finished having. Whatever you're about to do it quietly. And for God's sake, don't let it trace back to you. It won't. You always say that. Nate almost smiled, almost. Instead, he reached for his phone, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt something other than caution move through him, a small, stubborn spark of purpose, the same one that had once carried a hungry boy through a cold Nebraska winter and never quite gone out. Somewhere across the city, in a room with a window too narrow to show the sky, Grace Bennett closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against her belly, whispering the only prayer she had left, that whatever came next, her son would be born into a world kinder than the one that had just tried to bury his mother beneath a lie. She had no way of knowing that at that exact moment a decision was already being made on her behalf, quietly, deliberately, by a man she had never met, whose own life had been shaped by the same kind of injustice now closing in around her own. The arraignment was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, and by 8:40 the courthouse hallway outside courtroom 4B had already filled with the particular smell of old coffee and nervous sweat that seemed live permanently in the walls of every public building in Omaha. Emily Hart arrived early, as she always did, her leather folder tucked under one arm, a second cup of coffee in her free hand that she had bought without quite admitting to herself it was for Grace. She found her client seated on a wooden bench near the courtroom, doors, wrists free now, but her whole body still carrying the rigid, braced posture of someone who expected at any moment to be handcuffed again. How are you feeling? Tired. Grace accepted the coffee with both hands, grateful for its warmth more than its taste. Scared, if I'm honest. You're allowed to be both. Emily sat down beside her, lowering her voice. I want you to understand what's about to happen. The prosecutor is going to lay out the charges. I'm going to argue there's no physical evidence and no reasonable basis to hold you. It's a formality more than anything. The case as it stands wouldn't survive a serious court date, and I intend to make sure everyone in that room knows it. And if it doesn't work, then we fight it a different way. But it's going to work. Emily's voice carried a conviction that felt to Grace both reassuring and slightly bewildering, as if this stranger had decided somewhere between yesterday afternoon and this morning to care more about the outcome than the job required. What Grace did not know and would not learn for many weeks was that Emily's confidence had another source entirely: a phone call. The previous evening, from a private attorney she had never met, offering on behalf of an anonymous benefactor to cover any bail amount the court might set and to provide Emily with additional investigative resources quietly, with no name attached, no strings, no explanation beyond a single sentence relayed through an assistant. Someone believes this case was built to fail her. Emily had asked questions. The assistant had answered none of them. 2 rows back in the gallery, dressed in an unremarkable gray overcoat that made him look like any other mid-level attorney killing time before his own case was called, Nathaniel Calder sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched a gray Miss Lowe, young public defender he had spoken to only once by phone, through an intermediary, take her seat beside a woman he had never met, and already felt in some wordless way he did not yet trust himself to examine responsible for. He had told himself this was simple. A wrong committed, a wrong he happened to be positioned to correct. Nothing more. But watching Grace Bennett sit there with one hand resting protectively over her belly, her spine straight despite everything, something in Nate's chest tightened in a way business rarely managed anymore. He recognized the posture. He had seen it in his own mother years ago, standing in a welfare office with her chin lifted against a room full of people who had already decided who she was before she said a single word. The judge's gavel cracked once. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. The prosecutor, visibly unprepared for the thoroughness of Emily's argument, stumbled through a case built on a single, uncorroborated witness statement and no recovered property, and the judge, a woman with little patience for wasted court time, released Grace on her own recognizance pending further investigation with a pointed remark, suggesting the district attorney's office reconsider whether charges were warranted at all. Grace did not cry until she reached the hallway. Then she cried freely. One hand braced against the wall, Emily's arm around her shoulders, and neither of them noticed the man in the gray overcoat who slipped quietly out a side door before the crowd thinned, already dialing a number on a phone that would be discarded within the hour. "She's out, Nate," said the moment Petey picked up. "I heard. Congratulations, you bought yourself a headache." Petey's voice carried its usual dry edge, but beneath it Nate could hear something more serious waiting. "I finished the deeper trace on Everett's payment. You should sit down for this part. I'm driving. Then pull over." Nate did not pull over, but he did slow the car some instinct, telling him the words about to arrive deserved more attention than traffic allowed. The 30,000 wasn't a one-time thing, Petey said. It was a severance package. Structured, staged, 3 payments total, the last one cleared 2 days ago after she was already arrested. Whoever set this up didn't just want Jake Everett gone before the theft accusation. They wanted him gone and compensated for staying gone permanently no matter what happened to her afterward. Meaning someone knew there'd be an accusation before it happened. Meaning someone built the whole situation. Boyfriend disappears. She's isolated, nobody in her corner to vouch for her character, and then surprised she's suddenly standing alone in a room with a missing necklace and a witness who happens to work in the same house. Petey's voice hardened. This wasn't bad luck, Nate. This was engineered. Somebody wanted her isolated before they needed her to be blamed for something. Nate gripped the wheel, the city sliding past the windshield in a gray blur of storefronts and stoplights, and felt the old familiar heat rise behind his ribs. Not rage exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had once, a very long time ago, driven a hungry boy to swear that no one who depended on him would ever again be left with nothing. "Find out who authorized the payments," he said quietly. "Already working on it. But Nate, I need you to hear me on this. Every step you take toward this woman is a step toward Whitmore's front door. And Whitmore has spent 30 years building relationships with exactly the kind of people who'd love an excuse to look harder at yours. I'm not going near his front door. You're already in his hallway. You bailed his housekeeper out, Nate. Anonymously or not, that's not nothing. She didn't do anything wrong, Petey. I believe you. I do." Petey's voice softened just slightly, the closest he ever came to conceding a point. "But you built 2 entire lives specifically so they'd never touch each other. The hotels, the foundation, the whole respectable Nathaniel Calder, the papers write about, and then this other thing, the thing your uncle handed you whether you wanted it or not. You've kept those worlds apart for 20 years because the day they collide, everyone in both of them gets hurt. I'm asking you to remember that before you decide one pregnant stranger is worth the risk." Nate was quiet for a long moment, the phone warm against his ear, the city lights beginning to blur gold against the coming dusk. "My mother once told me," he said finally, "that the measure of a man isn't what he does when it's easy. It's what he does when doing the right thing costs him something real. Your mother," Petey said, "also told you to finish your vegetables, and you still don't. Petey, I'm just saying. Not every piece of advice from childhood needs to become a governing philosophy." But there was no real argument left in his voice. And both men knew it. Petey exhaled long and resigned, the sound of a man setting down a fight he'd never expected to win in the first place. "Fine," he said. "I'll keep digging." Quietly. "But Nate, whoever's running this operation against her isn't finished. Whitmore didn't spend that kind of money and build that kind of trap just to walk away because a judge let her go this morning. If he engineered this once, he'll try again." Nate said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already true. He ended the call and drove the rest of the way to his office in silence, one hand occasionally drifting without his permission to the small silver pendant beneath his shirt, as if some part of him already understood long before his mind, caught up that this particular thread once pulled was never going to lead him back to where he started. Behind him, in a small rented apartment on the east side of town, Grace Bennett lay awake long past midnight, one hand resting on her belly, staring at a ceiling she did not recognize as home, wondering for the first time since her arrest who exactly had cared enough about a stranger to make sure she didn't spend another night behind bars. She did not yet have a name to put to that kindness. but she found herself, despite everything, unable to stop searching the dark for one. The apartment Grace had been staying in since her release belonged technically to no one. She knew a small furnished unit above a laundromat on the east side of Omaha rent, paid 3 months in advance by a source Emily Hart described only as a legal fund that handles situations like yours. Grace had asked more than once which fund, which lawyer, which name belonged to the kindness that had suddenly appeared around her, like scaffolding around a building about to collapse. Emily had only shaken her head. I don't know everything either, she admitted the 4th or 5th time Grace pressed her. I was told the same thing you were. Someone believes your case was built to fail. That's all I have. That's not an answer. No, Emily agreed. It isn't. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and unremarkable, when the man finally appeared in person for the first time. Grace was sitting at the small kitchen table sorting through a stack of paperwork Emily had left with her release conditions, a list of community resources, a business card for an obstetrician who apparently now saw her free of charge when a knock came at the door. Quiet and deliberate. 3 knocks. And a pause. She opened it expecting Emily. Instead, she found a tall man in a plain wool coat, unremarkable in the particular way that only truly expensive clothing manages to be unremarkable. His hands empty except for a manila folder held loosely at his side. Miss Bennett. My name is Nathaniel Calder. He did not extend his hand, seeming to sense correctly that she would not want to shake it. I believe you've been receiving some assistance through Miss Hart's office. I wanted to speak with you myself if you'll allow it. Grace stood very still in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, studying him with the particular wariness of someone who had learned recently and painfully exactly how easily kindness could be a costume for something else. Entirely. You're the one paying for all this. I'm the one who arranged for it, yes. Why? It was the question he had known was coming, and still standing there in the hallway with the smell of detergent drifting up from the laundromat below, he found himself hesitating longer than he meant to. Because I looked into what happened to you, he said finally, and I didn't like what I found. Because I know what it costs a person to be disbelieved by everyone who's supposed to protect them. And because I was in a position to do something about it, and doing nothing felt like its own kind of guilt. That's not an answer either. Not really. Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or something closer to respect. No, he admitted. I suppose it isn't. She studied him a moment longer, then stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either. You can come in. I don't have much to offer you. Coffee maybe if the machine still works. Coffee's fine. He sat at the small kitchen table across from her, looking for a man of obvious wealth, faintly out of place, among the mismatched chairs, and the second-hand microwave humming on the counter. Not uncomfortable exactly, but oddly familiar with the smallness of the room. The way someone recognizes a place they used to live even after years away. Can I ask you something? Grace said, setting 2 chipped mugs on the table. Why does it not surprise you that I might be innocent? Everybody in that house, people I worked for 2 years, believed the worst about me in under a minute. You're a total stranger, and you didn't hesitate. Nate wrapped both hands around his mug, watching the steam rise between them before he answered. Maybe because I wasn't in the room when it happened. I wasn't caught up in the panic of a missing necklace and a family's embarrassment. I only saw the facts once they reached me, no evidence. One convenient witness and a boyfriend who vanished right on schedule with a payment in his account. Facts don't lie the way people do. You investigated me. I investigated the situation. A small, careful correction. Not you specifically. I wanted to understand what happened before I decided whether to get involved. And you decided I was worth getting involved for. I decided the truth was worth defending. You happened to be standing at the center of it. He paused, something more private moving behind his eyes. My mother once got accused of something she didn't do a long time ago. A grocery store manager, a loaf of bread she'd already paid for. Nobody believed her either. I've never forgotten what that did to her, the way she apologized anyway, because arguing wasn't a luxury she could afford. Grace's hands stilled around her mug. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He said it simply without inviting further questions, and Grace, sensing the boundary as clearly as if he'd drawn a line on the table between them, did not push. They sat in a silence that was surprisingly not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that exists between 2 people who have both learned the hard way exactly how much easier silence is than explanation. I don't accept charity easily, Grace said eventually. I want you to know that. Whatever this is, I intend to pay it back. It's not charity. Then what is it? Nate considered the question longer than it seemed to deserve. Call it an apology, he said, finally, on behalf of a world that failed you before I ever showed up in it. Over the following 2 weeks, he came back 3 more times. Never announced, always brief, always careful to keep an appropriate distance that Grace found, despite herself, oddly reassuring. He asked about the baby once gently, almost hesitantly, as though unsure he had the right to ask at all. He never asked about the case directly, seeming to trust that Emily was handling it, and never once mentioned money again after that first visit. It was on the 5th visit, a rainy Thursday evening, with the laundromat's fluorescent glow bleeding faintly through the curtains, that Grace finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been sitting unspoken at the bottom of every conversation between them. Who are you really? Not the company, not the name in the papers. I don't even know where you live or what your family's like, or why a man with your kind of money spends his Thursday nights drinking bad coffee in an apartment above a laundromat. Something shifted in his expression, not evasion exactly, but a kind of careful weighing, as though he were deciding in real time how much of himself he could afford to hand her. I grew up not far from here, he said finally. Poorer than you'd believe if I told you the whole truth of it. My mother raised me alone. We didn't always have heat in the winter. There were nights I went to bed hungry, and told myself it was fine because telling myself otherwise wouldn't have put food on the table. He turned the mug slowly in his hands, not quite meeting her eyes. I built something out of that. A company, a name people respect now. But I've never forgotten what it felt like to be invisible to people who had everything. I suppose that's the plainest answer I have. I help you because somebody once should have helped my mother and nobody did. Grace listened, something in her chest, loosening in a way she didn't fully trust, not yet, not after everything the world had recently taught her about trusting too quickly. You still haven't told me your family's like. A faint, almost involuntary smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him. Small, he said. Smaller than it should be. I lost track of most of it a long time ago. He did not elaborate, and something in his voice told her not to ask further. Not tonight, not yet. Outside, the rain thickened against the window, and somewhere beneath his shirt, hidden and unseen, a small silver pendant sat cold against his skin, carrying half a story neither of them yet understood they shared. Thank you, Grace said quietly, for not pretending this is simple. Nothing worth doing usually, as Nate said. And for a moment, in the dim light of that small rented kitchen, 2 people who had both spent their lives learning not to trust kindness allowed themselves just barely to believe in it a little. The Whitmore family's attorneys did not give up easily, and by the 3rd week after Grace's release, Emily Hart found herself buried under a fresh wave of motions, designed to slow the case into exhaustion requests for additional discovery, a subpoena for Grace's medical records that had nothing to do with the theft, charge a formal complaint questioning whether the public defender's office had a conflict of interest given the unusual outside funding behind Grace's bail. It was this last motion that brought Nathaniel Calder to Emily Hart's cramped downtown office on a Wednesday evening, long after the rest of the building had emptied. For the night, the hallway lights dimmed to half their normal brightness and the elevator groaning somewhere far below. You need to know how deep this money trail can be followed, Emily said, without preamble, gesturing him toward the single free chair across from her desk, which was otherwise buried beneath case files stacked in uneven towers. Whitmore's lawyers are already asking questions about who's funding Grace's defense. If they trace it back to you, it doesn't just complicate the case, it becomes the case. They won't trace it. You keep saying that. Emily rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion of the past weeks, finally showing through the composure she wore like armor most days. I've been doing this for 6 years, Mr. Calder. I've watched money like yours disappear behind shell companies plenty of times before. It always surfaces eventually. Always. Then let it surface after the case is settled. That's not how risk works. She studied him across the cluttered desk, something sharper than professional caution entering her expression. Why does this matter so much to you? A stranger, a housekeeper you'd never met before 3 weeks ago. Men like you don't usually risk this much for people who can't do anything for you in return. Nate was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Emily assumed he wouldn't answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something lower, more private. Because I know what it costs to be disbelieved by everyone who's supposed to protect you, he said. And because doing nothing when I was in a position to do something felt like its own kind of guilt I wasn't willing to carry. Something in his tone caught her off guard. Not the words themselves, which sounded rehearsed, careful the kind of answer a man gives when he's given it before, but the flicker underneath them, quick and unguarded, gone almost before she registered it. That's a very practiced answer, Emily said quietly. Is it wrong? No. I just don't think it's the whole truth. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, studying him the way she might study a witness she suspected of holding something back. You want to know something strange? I don't think you're what people assume you are either. The papers make you sound like some untouchable success story, self-made, generous, a little mysterious. But you sit in this office at 9 o'clock at night worrying about a housekeeper's bail motion like it's the only thing on your calendar. That's not the profile of a man who does this for good publicity. Maybe I just don't like watching people get crushed by systems built to protect the people who already have everything. Maybe. Emily's voice softened just slightly, and for a moment the careful distance between them narrowed into something almost like understanding. My father used to say something similar. He was a beat cop here in Omaha almost 20 years. He used to come home furious about cases where the truth was obvious and nobody with power cared enough to chase it. Used to. He was killed when I was 14. Emily said it plainly, the way people say things they've said many times before, sanding down the sharpest edges through sheer repetition. Shot during what the department called a related incident, connected to an organized crime investigation he'd been quietly working outside his usual assignment. They never fully explained what that meant. They gave my mother a folded flag and a pension, and told her the case was still open. It's been 16 years. It's still open. Nate's expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes went very still. The particular stillness of a man carefully controlling a reaction he did not want observed. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than the words could carry. "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't reopen a case." Emily exhaled something almost bitter creeping into her voice. "I went to law school because of him, you know. I told myself I'd spend my life making sure the people the system was built to ignore actually got heard. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I'd never let myself get close to anything connected to that world, the organized crime side of this city, whatever ugly machinery took my father from us. I don't care how much money someone has or how good their reasons sound. If there's even a shadow of that world near someone, I keep my distance." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Emily began to wonder if she'd said too much, revealed more of herself than the conversation had called for. When Nate finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, careful in a way that had nothing to do with legal strategy. "You have every right to that promise." "I know I do." She studied him for a moment, something curious and unresolved in her expression. "Why does it feel like that bothers you more than it should?" "It doesn't." The lie came out smoother than he expected, and he hated himself for how easily it did. He excused himself not long after citing an early meeting he did not actually have, and walked out into the cold Omaha night with his coat collar turned up against the wind, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, one fist closing without his permission around the small silver pendant beneath his shirt. He sat in his car outside the office building for almost 20 minutes without starting the engine, staring at nothing, replaying Emily Hart's voice in his head. "If there's even a shadow of that world near someone, I keep my distance," and feeling for the first time in longer than he could. Remember something close to real fear. Not the calculated caution he'd spent 2 decades cultivating in every business deal and every quiet transaction of the world his uncle had left him. Something raw, something that felt uncomfortably like the particular terror of a man who has just realized he wants something he has no right to want. He thought of every version of himself Emily Hart had glimpsed so far: the anonymous benefactor, the careful stranger at Grace's kitchen table, the tired man sitting across from her desk at 9 o'clock at night. All of them true, none of them complete. And somewhere beneath every one of those versions waited the man Petey had warned him never to let anyone see the head of an inheritance. He had never asked for carrying a name whispered in rooms Emily Hart would never willingly enter. She would never forgive it, he thought. And the thought arrived with a weight he hadn't braced for. Not this, not me. He drove home slowly that night, the city lights blurring past in long gold streaks against the windshield, and told himself the way he had told himself countless times before, about countless other things, that distance was the safest choice, that whatever had begun to take root in that cluttered office, in the particular way Emily Hart argued with him, like she actually expected him to be honest, was a door better left closed. He did not close it. He simply hesitated, and in that hesitation something in him had already decided. 2 miles away, alone in her apartment above the laundromat, Grace Bennett sat awake with her hand resting on her belly, feeling the faint, persistent flutter of movement beneath her palm, and found herself thinking, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, about the strange, careful sadness she'd noticed in Nathaniel Calder's eyes the last time he'd visited. A sadness that had nothing to do with her case at all. She did not yet know his secret. She only knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent her whole life reading rooms for signs of danger, that whatever he was carrying it alone, and that some part of her, against every instinct telling her to keep Her distance from a stranger's private grief wanted very place, badly to understand it. The call came on a Sunday morning while Grace was folding a small stack of donated baby clothes someone from Emily's office had left on her doorstep. It was a neighbor from the small town of Fremont, an hour northwest of Omaha, a woman named Carol, who had lived next door to Martha Bennett for the better part of 2 decades. "Grace, honey, it's Carol. I think you need to come home. Your mother collapsed yesterday evening. We wanted to call an ambulance, but she wouldn't hear of it, said she was waiting on you." Grace's hands went still around a tiny yellow onesie, the fabric suddenly heavier than it should have been. "Waiting on me for what she didn't say. She just kept saying your name." The drive to Fremont would normally have taken Grace almost 2 hours by bus with a transfer and a long walk from the last stop, a trip she had made perhaps twice a year since starting work at the Whitmore house, always apologizing to Martha for how little time she had, always promising to visit more. Once the baby came, once things settled, once life allowed her the luxury of settling. If you're watching this video and find it interesting and meaningful, don't forget to support our YouTube channel by subscribing or by liking and sharing this video with your friends so they can discover it too. Your support, even simply by subscribing to our channel, is a tremendous source of motivation and joy for our entire team. And now let's continue the story together. She was standing on the curb outside her apartment, phone in hand, trying to calculate bus schedules through the fog of panic when a familiar car pulled up beside her. Nate rolled down the window. "Petey mentioned your neighbor called the office, looking for a way to reach you. I hope that's all right. You have people listening for calls to my apartment now. I have people making sure nothing slips through the cracks while your case is still open. It's not as sinister as it sounds." He studied her face, the raw worry still visible beneath her composure, and softened his voice. "Get in. I'll drive you. You don't have to do that. I know I don't." He reached across and pushed the passenger door open from the inside. "Get in, Grace. It's going to take you 3 hours by bus, and your mother doesn't have 3 hours to spare on waiting." She hesitated only a moment before climbing in one hand, automatically bracing beneath her belly as she settled into the seat, and Nate pulled away from the curb without another word, letting the silence between them stretch comfortably as the city thinned into open highway. They were nearly 40 minutes outside Omaha, the flat Nebraska farmland, rolling past in long gold-brown stretches beneath a pale autumn sky, when Grace finally spoke again, her voice smaller than usual. "Can I tell you something strange?" "Of course. I've had this dream since I was a little girl. Not every night, but often enough that I remember it clearly." She kept her eyes on the passing fields, as though it were easier to say aloud while looking at nothing in particular. "There's a crib and I'm in it, and I can hear another baby crying somewhere close by, right beside me almost. But when I try to turn my head to see, I can't. I'm too small. I just lie there listening to it cry, and then it stops all at once, and I never find out why." Nate's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "Have you told your mother about it?" "A few times when I was young. She always changed the subject so fast it scared me a little, like the question itself hurt her somehow." Grace shook her head slowly. "I stopped asking eventually. I told myself it was just a strange dream the kind kids invent, but it's never really gone away. Even now, some nights I still hear it." "Do you know why she never told you more?" "No. That's the part that's always bothered me most. Every time I asked about my father, about where I was born, about anything from before I was maybe 4 years old, she'd get this look, fear almost, and change the subject so fast it was like the question itself burned her." Grace pressed a hand flat against the window glass, watching her own reflection blur against the passing fields. "I used to think it was just grief. Losing my father so young, whatever that story actually was. Now I don't know. Something in me has always said it's more than grief." Nate said nothing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, though something behind them had gone very far away, chasing a memory of his own. A woman's voice, decades old, saying, "Someday when you're older I'll tell you. Everything, I promise." A promise that had never been kept, because there had been no time left to keep it. Sometimes, he said finally, carefully, the people who love us most build silence around the things that frighten them, because they believe the silence is protecting us. It rarely is. It usually just delays the pain to a day when we're less prepared for it. Grace turned to look at him, something searching in her expression. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am." He offered nothing further, and she didn't press, sensing the same way she had sensed it weeks ago in her kitchen. A boundary drawn not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of something closer to old unhealed grief. They drove the rest of the way in a silence that felt this time less like distance and more like two people quietly keeping each other company inside their own private storms. Fremont arrived in familiar pieces. The water tower Grace had climbed halfway up as a reckless 12-year-old. The diner where Martha used to buy her a milkshake on the rare good months. The small blue house at the end of Miller Street with its sagging porch and its overgrown rose bushes, that Martha had never quite found the energy to prune since her husband passed. Carol met them at the door, her face drawn with worry. "Thank God. She's in the back bedroom. She's been asking for you every hour since sunrise." Grace moved through the house faster than her body wanted, to allow one hand trailing along the familiar hallway wall, and found Martha propped against a stack of pillows, her breathing shallow, her face gray, in a way that made Grace's stomach drop. "Mama." Grace knelt beside the bed, taking one thin, papery hand in both of hers. I'm here now." Martha's eyes opened slowly, and something in them relief, and beneath it something heavier settled as she focused on Grace's face. "You came. Why didn't you go to the hospital?" Carol said. "You refused." "Because some things," Martha said, her voice thin but resolute, "a mother has to say to her daughter's face. Not to a doctor. Not to a stranger holding a clipboard." Her gaze drifted briefly to the tall man standing quietly in the doorway, offering the two of them privacy without fully leaving the room, and something like recognition flickered across her expression. Not of the man himself, but of the kind of steadiness he represented. The kind Martha herself had spent 30 years trying to give a child that wasn't biologically her own. "Mama, please let me call for help." "Sit, Grace. Listen to me first." Martha's grip tightened surprisingly firm given how frail her hand had felt only moments before. "I have carried something too long. I should have told you years ago, when you were old enough to understand, but I was afraid. I've always been afraid. Afraid of what you've never done anything to be afraid of, Mama. You raised me. You worked yourself to exhaustion so I'd never go hungry. That's exactly what I need you to hold on to," Martha said, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes before I tell you the rest. "Whatever you learn today, whatever it changes about what you think you know, the love was real. It was always real, even if the beginning wasn't what you believe it was." Grace felt something cold move through her chest, a dread she couldn't yet name. "Mama, what are you trying to tell me?" Martha's grip tightened once more, and behind her, framed in the doorway, Nathaniel Calder went very still, some instinct he couldn't yet explain, telling him that whatever this dying woman was about to say would reach far beyond the small blue house on Miller Street, further even than either woman in that room could possibly imagine. "You were not born to me," Grace Martha whispered. "Not from my own body. I am not your mother. Not by blood." The words hung in the quiet room like something physical, something Grace could almost feel pressing against her chest, and for a long suspended moment no one in that house moved at all. Nobody in the small bedroom on Miller Street moved for what felt like a very long time. The late afternoon light slanted through the thin curtains, catching dust in the air, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice and fell silent, as if even the world beyond the window understood that something irreversible had just been spoken. Aloud. "Mama." Grace's voice came out barely above a whisper, the word she had spoken her whole life, suddenly heavy, with a question she had never thought to ask it. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Martha's hand trembled inside Grace's grip, but her eyes, though clouded with pain, remained steady. 23 years ago I was very poor, Grace. Poorer than you ever knew growing up. Your father, my husband, had just died. I'd lost a baby of my own at birth only weeks before. I had nothing left. No husband, no child, no money to bury either of them properly. "Mama, please, you don't have to." "I do have to. I've waited too long already." Martha drew a slow, rattling breath. "A woman came to me one night. I never learned her name. She offered me more money than I had ever seen in my life, enough to start over, completely enough to disappear from the life I'd been living. And she gave me a baby. A healthy little girl only days old. She told me to take the money, take the child, and go somewhere far away. She told me never to speak of it to anyone." Grace felt the room tilt slightly, though she had not moved. "And you didn't ask questions." "I was drowning, Grace. She threw me a rope. I told myself I'd only keep you until I understood what was right, until I found out where you'd truly come from, whether there was somewhere better for you to be. But then I held you. I fed you. I heard you laugh for the first time, and I could not give you up. You became mine in every way that mattered, even if you didn't start that way. Then who am I?" The question came out cracked smaller than Grace intended. "If I'm not your daughter, if not you, then whose daughter am I? I don't know everything, my darling. The woman who gave you to me worked for someone with money, someone with power. She never told me the full truth, only that keeping you safe meant keeping you hidden. Martha's eyes drifted unfocused for a moment before finding Grace's face again with sudden, fierce clarity. There's a box, Grace. Under my bed. Everything I managed to keep is inside it, documents, a photograph, a locket that was around your neck the night I received you. I could never bring myself to destroy any of it. I always knew someday you would need it. Grace's hands were shaking now as she reached beneath the bed frame, pulling out a small wooden box, its edges worn soft with age, a thin layer of dust along the lid that suggested it had not been opened in years. Mama, stay with me, Grace said, her voice breaking. We'll figure this out together. Please just don't stop breathing. My Grace. Martha's voice had gone very quiet now, more breath than sound. Whatever you find in that box, know this: raising you was the greatest joy of my life. Blood or not, you were my daughter. You will always be my daughter. I'll get help. Hold on, please. No time for that. Martha's hand loosened in Grace's grip. Her eyes finding briefly the tall figure still standing quietly near the door. A stranger to her, and yet in the dim light of that final afternoon, something in her expression seemed almost to recognize him, or perhaps only to trust the steadiness he offered without a single word spoken between them. Find out who you are, my daughter. But please be careful. Never forget who loved you first. The breath that followed was the last one. The room went very still. Mama, no. Grace pressed her forehead against Martha's shoulder. The wooden box forgotten for a moment beside her on the quilt, and let herself weep the way she had not allowed herself to weep since the handcuffs first closed around her wrists. Nate did not move from the doorway. He had learned a long time ago that grief needed nothing performed toward it, no rushed comfort, no hollow reassurance, only space, and the quiet certainty that someone capable was standing close enough to catch what came next. It was nearly an hour later, after Carol and the funeral home attendants had come and gone, after Grace had washed her face and sat hollow and exhausted at Martha's small kitchen table, that she finally reached for the wooden box. Again, Nate sat across from her, a cup of untouched tea cooling between his hands, watching her fingers hesitate over the lid. You don't have to open it tonight, he said gently. It's waited 23 years. It can wait one more day if you need it to. No. Grace shook her head, something resolute settling over her exhaustion. She died, trying to give me this. I owe her and myself the courage to finish what she started. She lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded birth certificate, yellowed with age, bearing a name that meant nothing to her. Calder beneath a hospital seal she didn't recognize. Beneath that, a single black and white photograph, slightly warped with time, showing two bassinets pushed close together in what looked like a modest maternity ward, two infants barely visible beneath thin hospital blankets. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a scrap of faded cloth, a small silver pendant, half of a broken heart, its jagged edge catching the kitchen light. Grace lifted it carefully, turning it over in her palm. This was around my neck. The night she got me. Across the table, Nate had gone very still, his own hand rising almost against his will to the collar of his shirt. Grace, he said, his voice unsteady, in a way she had never heard from him before. I need you to look at something. He drew the chain out from beneath his collar and set his own half of the pendant on the table between them, the broken edge catching the light exactly as hers had. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The two halves sat there on Martha's old kitchen table, inches apart, matching perfectly in shape and wear, in the particular tarnish that comes only from decades against skin. Where did you get that? Grace whispered. My mother, Nate said, his voice barely more than breath. She put it around my neck when I was small. I've worn it every day since she died. I never knew there was a second half. I never knew to look for one. Grace's hand trembled as she reached across the table, not quite touching either pendant, as if touching them might make whatever this was irreversibly real. Nathaniel. Her voice had changed, some instinct rising beneath the shock, older and more certain than conscious thought. What was your mother's name? He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw for the first time something she had not expected to find in a man of his composure and quiet control. Fear raw, and unguarded, the fear of a man standing at the edge of an answer he had waited his entire life to hear and was suddenly terrified to receive. Ruth, he said. Ruth Calder. Grace looked down at the birth certificate, still resting in her lap, at the name printed beneath the hospital seal, and felt the last solid ground beneath her entire understanding of her own life quietly give way. That's the name on my birth certificate, she said. Calder. Outside, the last light of the day faded slowly over the small blue house on Miller Street, and inside, at a worn kitchen table, beside two matching pieces of broken silver, two strangers sat in stunned silence, each beginning in their own way to understand that the story they had believed about their own lives was about to come apart entirely, and be rebuilt into something neither of them had dared to imagine. Neither of them slept that night. Grace sat curled in the corner of Martha's old sofa, with a quilt pulled around her shoulders, the wooden box open on the coffee table between her and Nate, its contents spread out like fragments of a language they were only beginning to learn to read. Nate sat across from her in a wingback chair that had belonged to Martha's late husband, his half of the pendant still resting on his open palm, as though setting it down anywhere else might make it disappear. "Tell me everything you remember," Grace said quietly for what felt like the 10th time that night. "About your mother. About before." Nate turned the small piece of silver over between his fingers, his voice when it came low and careful, as though each memory had to be excavated from somewhere he rarely allowed himself to visit. "Her name was Ruth. She raised me alone in a rented duplex on the edge of Omaha, the kind of place where the heat worked maybe half the winter, and everyone on the block knew everyone else's business because thin walls didn't leave much choice. She worked 2 jobs most of my childhood days, at a laundry service nights, cleaning offices downtown. I don't remember a father. I asked about him exactly once when I was 6, and the look on her face frightened me enough that I never asked again. What happened to her? She died when I was 11. Pneumonia, they told me, though. Looking back, I've always wondered if exhaustion had more to do with it than any doctor admitted." His jaw tightened, an old grief surfacing beneath his composure. "After that, I went to live with my uncle, my mother's brother, a man named Walter. He wasn't the kind of family the world would call ideal. He ran businesses that didn't always keep to the letter of the law, and by the time I was old enough to understand what those businesses actually were, I was already too deep inside his world to walk away cleanly." "Is that the world Petey keeps warning you about?" Protecting Nate's eyes, lifted to hers, sharp with sudden caution. "You notice that. I notice most things, Nathaniel. I've had a lot of practice reading rooms I wasn't supposed to understand." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to explain everything tonight. I'm asking whether there's a reason my mother Martha spent 23 years terrified of a secret that might now be connected to you." He was quiet for a long moment, the weight of the question settling over him like something physical. "There might be," he admitted finally. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out whatever it costs me to do it." Grace reached across the space between them, and for the first time, closed her hand gently over the pendant, still resting in his palm, the 2 halves nearly touching. "Then we find out together. Whatever you are, Nathaniel, whoever your uncle made you become, I don't think that's the whole truth of who you are. I've watched you for weeks now. Nobody performs kindness this consistently, this quietly, unless it's real." Something in his chest, some old and carefully maintained wall, gave way just slightly at her words. Not collapsing entirely, but cracking enough to let something warmer through. "There's a piece of this I haven't told you," he said, his voice unsteady. "My mother used to say before she died that she had a sister once, that there had been a baby, a girl born before me, who didn't survive. I never questioned it. I was too young, and grief doesn't invite questions." He looked down at the pendant. What if that was never true? What if there was a sister and she didn't die at all? What if she was simply taken? Grace felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest, a truth she had not yet allowed herself to fully believe rising now with undeniable weight. "Nathaniel," she said softly, "I think I'm your sister." The words hung between them in the quiet room, enormous and impossible, and somehow entirely true. Nate called Petey just after dawn, his voice rough with exhaustion, and something Petey had rarely heard in it before, a rawness that made him sit up straighter at his kitchen table, before Nate had said more than a few words. "I need you in Fremont. Now." "Nate, it's 6 in the morning, what, Petey?" "I found her." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "I found my sister." Petey arrived less than an hour later, cane in hand, moving faster across Martha's front yard than his usual gait, allowed his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, as Nate laid the pendant, the birth certificate, and the photograph out on the kitchen table before him. "This is real," Petey said finally, not quite a question, studying the 2 matching halves of silver with something close to reverence. 20 years I've known you, Nate. 20 years, and I never once heard you mention a sister who might still be alive. I didn't know to look for her." Petey looked up first at Nate, then at Grace, seated quietly beside him with one hand resting on her belly, watching this stranger absorb the same impossible truth she and Nate had spent the entire night absorbing themselves. "I owe you an apology," Petey said, slowly turning to Grace. "I've spent weeks telling Nate this whole thing was reckless. That helping you was a liability he couldn't afford. I was wrong. I didn't know what I was actually standing in the way of." "You were protecting him," Grace said. "That's not something to apologize for." "Maybe not. But I watched a man who spent his whole life keeping every part of himself locked behind a door drive 3 hours to sit at a dying woman's bedside for a stranger, and I called it a liability. Petey shook his head, something in his expression softening into an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. I've known Nate since we were kids, sharing one winter coat between us because neither family could afford two. I know exactly what kind of hunger built the man sitting at this table. I should have trusted that hunger meant something better than caution. Nate reached over and gripped Petey's shoulder, something wordless passing between two men who had survived more together than either had ever fully spoken aloud. You've never once let me down, Petey. Not tonight, not in 20 years. Doubt was never a betrayal. It was you doing exactly what a real friend does. Petey cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the sincerity, and turned his attention back to the papers on the table, the familiar armor of practicality settling back over him like a second skin. All right. If this is real, and I believe it is, then somebody arranged for a newborn girl to disappear from a hospital and be handed off to a grieving widow 23 years ago. That's not an accident. That's a conspiracy with money behind it. And money like that leaves a trail. Even after 2 decades. He tapped the guardianship document, his eyes narrowing on the signature at the bottom. This name. Warren Whitmore. He signed off on the original transfer paperwork. Grace's breath caught. Warren Whitmore. My employer. Nate's expression went very still, the pieces of 2 separate griefs. Grace's stolen childhood and his own suddenly folding together into a single, unbearable shape. The same Warren Whitmore who paid Jake to disappear. The same man who let his own family accuse you of a theft you never committed. He's known this whole time, Grace whispered. He's had me working in his own house for 2 years, and he's known. That's why he reacted the way he did over the necklace, Petey said slowly, working it through aloud. It wasn't just about a missing piece of jewelry. If he recognized something in you, some resemblance, some connection, he was terrified. Someone else might eventually notice. Getting you discredited, disgraced, gone would have solved a problem he'd been sitting on for 2 decades. Nate stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. Something cold and resolute settling into his features that Grace had not yet seen from him. Not the careful benefactor, not the grieving son, but something closer to the man. Petey had spent 20 years quietly protecting the world from meeting. He took my sister from me, Nate, said his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. He let a family destroy her name to protect a secret. And he spent every day since building an empire on top of what he stole. Nate. Petey's voice carried a warning, gentle but firm. Whatever you're feeling right now, and you have every right to feel it, I need you to remember what you told me weeks ago. About your mother. About the measure of a man being what he does when doing the right thing costs him something. Nate closed his eyes, breathing slowly, visibly forcing the cold fury back beneath the surface where it could be managed rather than acted upon. You're right, he said, finally opening his eyes to find Grace watching him with something between fear and hope. We do this properly. Evidence, not vengeance. Whatever Warren Whitmore did, he answers for it in front of the whole world. Not in some quiet room where I decide what happens to him alone. Grace rose slowly from her chair and crossed the small kitchen to stand beside him, taking his hand, her brother's hand, in both of hers. Whatever this costs, she said quietly, we face it together. That's what family does. For the first time since the pendant had been placed on Martha's kitchen table, something in Nate's chest loosened entirely decades of solitary grief, finally finding, however unexpectedly, a place to rest. 3 days after Martha's funeral, Nate sat in his glass office on the 14th floor with the wooden box from Fremont open on his desk, the birth certificate and the faded photograph spread out beside a legal pad covered in Petey's cramped handwriting. Outside the window, Omaha stretched gray and ordinary beneath a low autumn sky, indifferent to the fact that everything Nate had believed about his own family had quietly come apart and been reassembled overnight. The hospital seal on the birth certificate belongs to Street Agnes Memorial Petey, said, tapping the document with one finger. Closed down almost 15 years ago, bought out and demolished for a parking structure. But hospitals like that kept staffing records with the state licensing board for decades, even after closure in case of malpractice claims. And you found something. I found a name. Petey slid a printout across the desk. A nursing license, faded but legible, issued decades earlier under the name Loretta Combs. She was the senior maternity nurse on duty at Street. Agnes, the year both of you were born. Retired 18 years ago. Current address, if the licensing board's records are still accurate, is a small house outside a town called Blair, about 40 minutes north of here. Nate studied the photograph clipped to the printout. An older woman, now gray-haired, her face lined with the particular weariness of someone who had spent a lifetime working nights. You think she remembers? I think if she was the senior nurse on duty, she processed every discharge paperwork that came through that ward. If a healthy newborn was quietly handed off to a grieving widow instead of going home with her biological mother, Loretta Combs, either signed off on it herself, or she knows exactly who did. Does she know we're coming? No. And I'd like to keep it that way. If she's spent 23 years sitting on something this heavy showing up unannounced, gives her less time to build a story before she has to decide whether to tell us the truth. Grace, seated in the chair beside Nate's desk, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, spoke quietly for the first time since the conversation began. I want to come with you, Grace. Nate's voice carried the particular gentleness he had begun, almost without noticing, to reserve only for her. You're 8 months along. If this woman reacts badly, if there's any risk at all, Nathaniel, I have spent my entire life not knowing who I am. I am not staying behind in an office while 2 men decide how much of my own story I'm allowed to hear firsthand. Her voice was steady, but something fierce moved beneath it. The same quiet resolve that had carried her through 2 years of humiliation in the Whitmore house without once breaking. I'll sit in the car if it gets dangerous, but I am going to Blair. Nate looked at her for a long moment, something like recognition passing across his face. The particular stubbornness he suspected, with a small, unexpected ache, might run in the family. All right, he said. Together then. The house outside Blair sat at the end of a gravel road, small and neat, with a single porch light burning against the gathering dusk. Loretta Combs answered the door on the third knock, wearing a cardigan buttoned to her throat despite the mild evening. And the moment her eyes landed on the 3 strangers standing on her porch, something in her expression shifted from polite confusion to something closer to dread. I don't know you, she said quickly, already stepping back. Please leave my property. Miss Combs, my name is Nathaniel Calder. Nate kept his voice low, deliberately unthreatening. One hand raised slightly in a gesture of harmlessness. This is my sister Grace. We're not here to hurt you. We only need to ask about something that happened a long time ago at Street Agnes Memorial. The color drained from Loretta's face so completely that for a moment Nate feared she might collapse where she stood. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. Grace stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. My mother, the woman who raised me, died 3 days ago. Before she passed, she told me I was switched at birth. That a man gave her money and a newborn baby and told her to disappear. I need to know if I'm that baby. I need to know if this is my brother. For a long moment, Loretta Combs stood frozen in her own doorway, one hand pressed to her chest, her eyes moving slowly between Grace's face and Nate's, as though searching for something in their features that only she would recognize. Oh my God, she whispered finally. Those eyes. Please, ma'am. Nate kept his voice steady, though something urgent had crept into it. Whatever you're afraid of, we need to know what happened that night. Loretta's hand trembled visibly against the doorframe. If I tell you, she said, they will destroy me. You don't understand the kind of power we're talking about. Ma'am, listen to me. Nate's voice dropped lower, carrying the particular calm authority that Petey had watched him use countless times before in rooms far more dangerous than this quiet porch in Blair, Nebraska. Whoever did this 23 years ago has likely already realized we're investigating. If they wanted to silence you quietly, they may already be considering it whether you speak to us tonight or not. Your silence hasn't been protecting you. It's only been delaying the moment they decide you're no longer useful to them. Something in Loretta's expression cracked at that. Not fear exactly, but a kind of exhausted recognition, as though she had privately known this truth for years and simply lacked the courage to act on it. Come in, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 23 years I've carried this. 23 years I've jumped at every knock on my door, waiting for the day it finally caught up with me. Maybe it's time the truth stopped rotting inside me before it dies with me. They sat in Loretta's small, cluttered living room, a single lamp casting long shadows across walls crowded with old photographs, a lifetime spent. Nate noted almost entirely alone. I was the senior nurse on duty the night both of you were born. Loretta began, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Your mother, Ruth Calder, had a difficult delivery. Twins, a boy and a girl, though the girl arrived first, small but healthy. In the same ward, only rooms away, another woman was giving birth that same night. A wealthy woman. Her family had significant influence in this city. Hospital board connections, political relationships, the kind of money that makes rules bend, without anyone officially breaking them. What happened? Grace's voice was barely audible. A man came to me 2 days after the delivery. Warren Whitmore. Even then, he was already a rising name in Omaha real estate circles already. The kind of man people were careful not to cross. Loretta's eyes grew distant, pulled back into a memory she had clearly spent decades trying to bury. He told me the wealthy family's own newborn had died shortly after birth, a tragedy, but not an uncommon one in those days, for a difficult delivery. He offered me an amount of money I could not refuse. A nurse's salary against a sum that could change my entire family's future. He asked me to quietly arrange for Ruth Calder's healthy daughter to be given to a grieving widow, instead to falsify the paperwork to make it look like a stillbirth on Ruth's side and a routine discharge on the widow's, and to never speak of it again. Why? Nate said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Why would he do that to my mother? What did he gain from tearing a family apart? Money, Loretta said simply. Your mother Ruth had recently come into a small inheritance, a modest trust left by a distant relative, meant to be split between any children she had. Warren Whitmore was at the time the attorney managing that trust, with only one surviving child instead of two, and with Ruth already struggling, exhausted, grieving what she believed was a stillbirth. He found it remarkably easy over the following years to convince her to sign over management of the remaining funds entirely into his care. Funds that quietly over 2 decades became the foundation of everything he built afterward. The room went very still. Nate sat with his hands clenched on his knees, staring at nothing, while Grace pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. He didn't just steal a child, Nate said, finally, his voice low and raw. He stole my mother's entire future to build his own. And he spent every year since making certain nobody ever connected the dots, Loretta said quietly. I heard years later that he found other uses for the arrangement too, watching where the child ended up, making sure certain families stayed comfortable, stayed quiet, stayed useful to him in exchange for keeping a discreet eye on someone he never wanted to lose track of. Grace's breath caught audibly. The Whitmores, my employers. He placed me there on purpose. It seems, Loretta said softly, his arrangement went even further than even I understood. Nate rose slowly from the worn armchair, something resolute and dangerously calm settling over his features. Would you be willing to say all of this on record in front of the authorities? Loretta looked up at him, tears finally spilling freely down her weathered face. I'm 71 years old, Mr. Calder. I have spent more of my life being afraid than being free. It would take real courage, but it might be the only way to give your family the justice I helped take from you. She reached out and took Grace's hand in both of hers, studying her face one last time with something like tenderness. I owed your mother that much before I die with this unconfessed. Yes, I'll speak. Outside, the porch light flickered once against the darkening sky, and somewhere on the gravel road, leading back toward Blair's main highway, a car that had been parked engine idling for the better part of 20 minutes finally pulled away into the night unnoticed by anyone inside the small house, its taillights disappearing into the dark, long before the three of them realized they were no longer entirely alone. While Nate, Grace, and Petey drove back from Blair in the gathering dark, Emily Hart sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home. A cardboard evidence box open on her desk. Her father's box, the one the department had, eventually returned to her mother years after closing the file, filled with the fragments of a 16-year-old case nobody had ever solved. She had pulled it out that evening for reasons she couldn't entirely explain to herself. Something about the past few weeks had unsettled a part of her. She usually kept carefully sealed, watching Nathaniel Calder move through Grace's case, with a quiet, unexplained authority that reminded her uncomfortably of the kind of power her father used to describe in hushed, careful tones at their kitchen table. There are people in this city, he'd told her once, not long before he died, whose names you'll never see printed anywhere, and that's exactly how you know they matter. She had told herself for weeks now that the resemblance was coincidence, that her instincts were simply overtuned from years of grief, seeing shadows of her father's unsolved case in every powerful man who crossed her path. But something about the careful, practiced way Nate answered questions, thorough, reasonable, and somehow always incomplete, had begun to gnaw at her in a way she could no longer ignore. She opened her father's old case file and began methodically to read. Most of it she had read before years ago in the raw aftermath of his death, when she'd still believed reading it enough times might somehow change the ending. Witness statements, ballistics reports, a partially redacted memo referencing an ongoing task force investigation into organized activity operating quietly beneath several of the city's real estate and hospitality developments. And then halfway down a page she had read perhaps a dozen times over the years without truly absorbing it. A single phrase previously meaningless now, seeming to leap off the page with sudden terrible clarity. Confidential informant reference organization known internally as the Quiet Shepherd. Emily sat very still, her hand pressed flat against the page, her heart pounding hard enough that she could hear it. She had heard that phrase before. Once weeks ago, in a hushed phone call she wasn't meant to overhear, drifting from the hallway outside Nate's private office, while she waited to discuss a filing deadline. P.D. Vance's voice low and urgent, the shepherd. Can't be connected to this Nate, not even by rumor. At the time she had assumed it was some internal nickname, corporate slang, nothing worth remembering. Now the phrase sat in front of her, printed in her murdered father's own case file. Connected, however tenuously, however the details might eventually unfold, to the exact circle of organized crime he had died investigating. She read the file 3 more times that night, piecing together fragments she had never fully understood. As a 14-year-old grieving daughter, her father had been quietly working outside his usual patrol assignment, feeding information to a task force investigating an organization that had over roughly 2 decades embedded itself so deeply into the city's legitimate business world that almost no one outside a small circle of law enforcement knew it existed at all. He had died 3 weeks into that assignment, in what the department had ultimately classified as an unrelated robbery gone wrong. A classification Emily had never once believed. By the time she closed the file, the sun was beginning to rise over the Omaha skyline, and something inside her had gone cold and very still. She found Nate at his office just after 8 the next morning, still in yesterday's close exhaustion, etched into every line of his face from the drive back from Blair, from a night that had already upended everything he understood about his own family. He looked up when she entered, and whatever relief or warmth might normally have crossed his face at the sight of her died instantly at the expression she wore. "Emily, tell me you're not connected to something called the Quiet Shepherd." Her voice was steady, controlled in the particular way of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. "Tell me I'm wrong and I'll believe you, and we'll never speak of this again." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough. It was in itself an answer. "Emily, let me explain. That's not a no." She took a step back, one hand rising instinctively toward the doorframe, as though she needed something solid to steady herself against. "My father died investigating an organization by that name 16 years ago. He was building a case against someone powerful enough that the department buried the investigation before it ever went to trial. Powerful enough that his own murder was reclassified as an unrelated robbery within a month. I have spent half my life trying to understand who took him from me, and you're telling me what exactly? That it's you." "Emily, I inherited that organization. I didn't build it. My uncle. I don't care whose name is on the paperwork." Her voice cracked, 16 years of carefully controlled grief finally breaking loose all at once. "I sat across from you in that little apartment kitchen. I watched you carry Grace's mother's coffin. I let myself actually believe that a man capable of that kind of quiet decency couldn't possibly be hiding something monstrous underneath it. And this whole time you've been the exact thing my father died trying to stop. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Nathaniel. Either you head that organization or you don't." Tears stood bright in her eyes, now refusing to fall, held back through sheer stubborn will. "I made a promise to myself when I was 14 years old, standing at a funeral in the rain, that I would never let anyone from that world get close to me. Never. And I broke that promise without even knowing it, because you were careful enough, gentle enough, convincing enough, that I never once thought to ask the question until it was already too late. I never lied to you. You let me believe a lie by omission every single day we spent in that office together." Her voice dropped quieter now, somehow more devastating than the shouting had been. "That's its own kind of lie, Nate. Maybe the worst kind, because it wears the face of honesty while it hides the one thing that actually matters." Nate came around the desk slowly, his hands open at his sides, the practiced composure that had carried him through 2 decades of careful negotiations, utterly failing him now. "Emily, please. Let me explain what that organization actually does under me. What I've spent years turning it away from. I can't." She was already backing toward the door, her voice thick, with a grief that had clearly been waiting 16 years for exactly this moment to finally break open. "I can't sit here and let you explain away the thing that killed my father like it's a footnote in your biography. I need you to understand that this isn't about whether you're a good man underneath it, Nathaniel. It's about whether I can spend the rest of my life pretending the underneath doesn't matter. And I can't. I won't." She turned and left before he could answer her footsteps, fading quickly down the hallway. The office door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final click that landed in the sudden silence of the room louder than any slammed door could have. Nate stood alone for a long moment, staring at the space where she had been before, sinking slowly into the chair behind his desk, his head in his hands. P.D. found him there 20 minutes later, still motionless, the morning light stretching long and pale across the office floor. "I take it that didn't go well." She knows. Nate's voice came out hollow, stripped of its usual control. She found the reference in her father's case file. The Quiet Shepherd. She thinks she believes that we're connected to what happened to him. Petey's expression sharpened instantly, all traces of his usual dry humor vanishing. Are we? I don't know. Nate lifted his head, something desperate and raw in his eyes that Petey had rarely seen there before, not even during the darkest years of their shared history. I need you to find out. Not to protect me, Petey. I don't care what it costs me anymore, what it exposes, whether it ends everything I've built. I need to know the truth, because she deserves it, whatever it turns out to be, and because if there's even a chance I can give her that truth honestly, it's the only thing that might ever bring her back. Petey studied his oldest friend for a long moment, something shifting behind his own carefully guarded expression. Respect, perhaps, or something closer to quiet awe at watching a man who had spent his entire adult life protecting himself. I finally choose without hesitation to risk everything for someone else. I'll start today, he said quietly. Whatever it takes. Outside the window, Omaha moved on beneath a gray autumn sky, entirely indifferent to the fact that somewhere within its ordinary streets, a 16-year-old grief and a newly discovered family were about to collide with a truth neither of them yet fully understood. Warren Whitmore's office occupied the top floor of a tower that bore his family's name in brushed steel letters 3 blocks from Nate Calder's own building, close enough that on clear days the two men's reflections might have crossed paths in each other's windows without either noticing. He was not a man given to visible panic, but the report his private security consultant delivered that morning left his hands unsteady enough that he set his coffee down twice before managing to keep the cup from rattling against its private security consultant delivered that morning. Souser. They went to Blair. The consultant said a lean, quiet man named Rourke, who had spent 15 years handling matters Whitmore preferred never to discuss in writing. Calder, the housekeeper, and one of his people, spent nearly 2 hours with Loretta Combs before driving back to Omaha last night. And Combs said nothing to indicate whether, "We don't have audio from inside the house, sir." Only confirmation they were there, and confirmation that the visit lasted considerably longer than a courtesy call. Whitmore stood and crossed to the window, looking out over a city he had spent 23 years, quietly reshaping into an extension of his own ambition, and felt for the first time in longer than he could remember the particular cold certainty of a man watching a carefully built structure begin to show its first hairline cracks. Find out what she told them, he said finally, and find out everything Calder's people have accessed in the last month: court records, hospital archives, licensing, databases, anything. I want to know exactly how much rope they've already pulled through their hands before I decide how to cut it. And if it's already too much rope, sir. Whitmore did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more deliberate, the tone of a man who had made difficult decisions before and found each time that the difficulty diminished with practice. Then we removed the rope's other end. Across the city, in a cramped records room, 3 floors below the main Omaha Police Department archive, Petey Vance sat surrounded by cardboard boxes he had spent 2 days quietly requesting, through a retired detective he'd known for years, boxes that had officially been marked for destruction, and unofficially preserved at considerable personal risk to the detective in question, because something about the original case had never sat right with him either. The file on Officer Daniel Hart's death, 16 years cold, told a story considerably more complicated than the unrelated robbery classification that had closed it. Petey worked through the pages, methodically cross-referencing names, dates, and organizational references against everything he knew about the Quiet Shepherd's actual structure and activities. During that period, records he had unique access to, having managed the organization's ledgers himself for most of 2 decades. What he found by the 3rd hour made his stomach drop in a way few things had in years. Officer Hart had indeed been investigating organized activity in Omaha, but the informant network he'd been quietly cultivating hadn't been feeding him information about the Quiet Shepherd at all. It had been feeding him disinformation carefully constructed by a rival organization out of Kansas City that had spent the better part of that decade attempting to muscle into Omaha's territory by any means available, including framing an established local operation for crimes it hadn't committed, in hopes of triggering exactly the kind of law enforcement crackdown that would clear the field for their own expansion. Officer Hart had gotten close enough to the truth to become dangerous to the Kansas City operation, specifically not to Nate's uncle, not to the organization Nate had eventually inherited. The reference to the Quiet Shepherd in Hart's case file was itself part of the misdirection, a name planted deliberately in his informant's reports to send his investigation toward the wrong target, while the real threat eliminated him quietly and let a false trail take the blame. Petey sat back in his chair, the weight of what he'd found settling over him slowly. Emily Hart had spent 16 years believing her father died investigating Nate's world. In truth, he had died because he'd stumbled too close to uncovering the very deception that had for years kept suspicion pointed at an organization that had nothing to do with his death at all. He called Nate immediately. "You need to see this. All of it. Today. Petey, if this is bad news." "It's not bad news, Nate. It's the truth, and it's not what either of you thought it was." Petey's voice carried an urgency that made Nate straighten in his chair 3 floors above. "Her father wasn't investigating us. He was closing in on the Kansas City operation that used our name to cover their own tracks. They killed him, and they made sure the case file pointed everywhere except at themselves." Silence stretched on the line for a long moment. "Can you prove it?" "I have internal ledgers from that exact period showing our organization's actual activity nowhere near what Hart's informant reports describe. I have cross-referenced dates showing the Kansas City operation's known personnel in Omaha during the weeks leading up to his death. It's not airtight yet, but it's more than enough to show Emily the truth was never as simple as a name in a file." Nate closed his eyes, something between relief and grief moving through him all at once. Relief that the truth might finally reach. Emily grief for the 16 years she had carried a story that was never entirely accurate, built by men who had never once faced consequences for the damage their lie had caused. "Bring everything to my office," he said. "I want to see it myself before we take it anywhere near her. She deserves absolute certainty, not another half-truth dressed up as comfort." It was nearly evening by the time Petey arrived, a thick folder under one arm, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent an entire day staring at other people's tragedies laid out in cold administrative card. Language. He spread the documents across Nate's desk, one by one ledgers, cross-referenced timelines. An old surveillance photograph showing 3 unfamiliar men entering an Omaha warehouse during the exact week of Officer Hart's death. Men Petey had since identified through old contacts as known enforcers for the Kansas City operation. Nate studied each page slowly, methodically, the same careful attention he brought to every decision that mattered. When he finally looked up, something resolute had settled over his features. "I want to take this to her myself." "Nate." Petey's voice carried its familiar note of caution, though gentler now than it had been in weeks. "She might not want to hear it from you. Not yet. Not after yesterday." "I know." Nate began gathering the documents carefully into order. "But I also know what it cost me growing up every time someone withheld a truth from me because they thought I couldn't handle carrying it. My mother did that. Martha did that to Grace. I'm not going to do the same thing to Emily, even if it means she slams the door in my face the moment I show up." Petey studied his friend for a long moment, something like pride settling quietly behind his usual guarded expression. 20 years I've known you, and I still didn't expect this version of you to show up quite this fast." "What version is that?" "The one who stopped protecting himself first." Petey clapped a hand briefly on Nate's shoulder. "Go. I'll have security keep an eye on Whitmore's people tonight." Loretta's visit rattled him, and rattled men do stupid, dangerous things. "But go. This can't wait another day." Nate nodded once, gathered the folder, and left the office without another word, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway with a steadiness that belied everything, trembling underneath the fear that even the truth laid bare and undeniable might not be enough to undo the damage of a single unspoken secret. Behind him, unnoticed in the gathering dark outside the building, a black sedan idled at the curb for nearly 10 minutes before pulling slowly away, its presence noted only by a security camera whose footage would not be reviewed until it was almost too late. Emily Hart lived in a small brick duplex on the edge of Dundee, the kind of quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where porch lights came on early and neighbors still waved from their yards. When Nate knocked on her door, just after 8 that evening, folder in hand, he half expected her not to answer at all. She opened it anyway, still in her work clothes, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that told him she had spent the day crying, in the particular controlled way of someone determined not to let grief interfere with the job still waiting on her. Desk. "I don't want to talk to you tonight, Nathaniel. I know. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me." He held up the folder, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I'm here because I found out something today that belongs to you, not to me. And I wasn't willing to sit on it for even one more night, no matter how you feel about me right now." Something in his tone, not pleading, not defensive, simply resolute, made her hesitate at the threshold longer than she intended to. 5 minutes, she said, finally stepping back to let him in. They sat at her kitchen table, considerably smaller and plainer than his own, and he laid the documents out one by one exactly as Petey had laid them out for him hours earlier. The ledgers, the timelines, the surveillance photograph of 3 unfamiliar men entering a warehouse during the exact week her father died. I need you to understand something before you look at any of this, Nate said quietly. I am the head of an organization my uncle built and left to me, and I have spent almost every year since trying to turn it into something closer to harmless than harmful without ever fully succeeding, because some inheritances don't come with an exit clause. That part is true, and I won't pretend otherwise to make this easier for either of us. Then, what exactly am I looking at? Proof that whatever happened to your father, it wasn't us. He slid the surveillance photograph toward her. These men worked for a rival operation out of Kansas City. They spent years trying to break into Omaha by any means available, including feeding false information to law enforcement that pointed suspicion at us instead of themselves. Your father wasn't investigating the quiet shepherd Emily. He was closing in on the operation that used our name as cover. He got close enough to be dangerous to them and they killed him for it, and then they made sure the story pointed everywhere except at their own doorstep. Emily's hands trembled as she lifted the photograph, studying the faces of 3 men she had never seen before. Men who had, in some indirect and infuriating way, stolen not just her father's life but 16 years of her own. Understanding of why. How do I know this isn't just another version of the truth you'd prefer, I believe? You don't not from me alone. That's why I brought everything, the internal ledgers, the timelines, contact information for the retired detective who helped PD pull the original case file. Take it to someone outside my world entirely. An independent investigator, a journalist, whoever you trust, least to protect me. Verify every piece of it yourself. He met her eyes steadily. I'd rather you hate me for the rest of your life, having verified the truth, than have you accept a comfortable version of it just because it came from someone you might have loved. The word landed between them heavier than either of them seemed prepared for, and for a long moment neither spoke. Might have, Emily said finally quietly, not quite a question. Still do, Nate admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. That hasn't changed since yesterday, Emily, whatever else has. I understand if it doesn't matter to you anymore. I understand if it never can. But I wasn't going to let you sit here another 16 years believing a lie, whether or not it cost me everything to correct it. She looked down at the documents again, her fingers tracing the edge of the surveillance photograph. 16 years of carefully managed grief, threatening visibly to overwhelm the composure she had built her entire adult life around, maintaining. He used to come home some nights, she said quietly, and just sit in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes before he'd come inside. My mother would send me out to check on him, and he'd always say the same thing. Just needed a minute to leave it outside so it doesn't come in with me. I didn't understand what that meant until I was much older. I thought it meant the ordinary stress of the job. I never imagined it meant he was carrying something this heavy. Her voice cracked. And I've spent 16 years directing all my anger at a name in a file when the men who actually did it just walked away. Nobody ever answered for it. Nobody ever will now, probably. It's been too long. It's not too late, Nate said. PD's already identifying who's still active from that Kansas City operation. If there's a way to bring any of them to account even now, I intend to find it, not to protect myself, Emily. Because your father deserves better than a closed file with the wrong name attached to it. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, something in her posture beginning almost imperceptibly to soften. I still don't know how to feel about the rest of it. The organization. What you inherited. What you still are underneath everything else you've shown me. I don't expect you to resolve that tonight. Nate rose slowly from the table, gathering nothing, leaving every document with her exactly as promised. I just needed you to have the truth, whatever you decide to do with it, and with me. He was nearly at the door when her voice stopped him. Nathaniel. He turned. The way you've handled Grace's case, Emily said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud. The bail, the legal support driving her to Fremont, sitting with a dying woman you'd never met before that afternoon. None of that reads like a man protecting an empire. It reads like a man trying very quietly to become someone different than what he inherited. I'm trying, Nate said simply. I don't know if trying is enough. I don't know either. She held his gaze a moment longer, something unresolved and fragile passing between them. But I'm willing to find out. Slowly. On my own terms. And only after I've verified every single page you just handed me myself. That's more than fair. It's not forgiveness, Nathaniel. I didn't ask for forgiveness. Only honesty. He allowed himself, for the first time since walking through her door, the smallest measure of relief. Good night, Emily. Good night. He was 3 blocks from his car when his phone rang. Petey's name flashing across the screen, his voice tight with an urgency that cut through the fragile, unfamiliar hope Nate had been quietly nursing since leaving Emily's porch. Nate, we've got a problem. Loretta Combs isn't answering her phone. Security footage from her street shows a car parked outside her house for almost an hour this afternoon. Gone now, but it wasn't anyone from her usual visitors. Nate's chest tightened, every trace of the evening's fragile warmth replaced instantly by cold, focused alarm. Get someone out there now. Already on it. But Nate Whitmore's people were seen near your building tonight, too. Same time frame you were sitting in Emily's kitchen. Petey's voice dropped lower, grave in a way that left no room for reassurance. I think he knows exactly how close we've gotten, and I think he's done waiting to see what we do next. Nate stood very still on the quiet, tree-lined street, the porch lights of Dundee glowing warm and ordinary around him, entirely unaware of the danger gathering just beyond their reach. Get Grace somewhere safe, he said, his voice hard and immediate. Tonight, I'm on my way. Grace was already gathering a small bag of essentials when Petey arrived at her apartment above the laundromat, his usual measured calm replaced by a brisk, focused urgency that told her before he said a single word exactly how serious the situation had become. We need to move now, Petey said. Nate wants you somewhere secure. I've got a car outside. Is Loretta all right? We don't know yet. That's exactly why we're not taking any chances with you. He took the bag from her hands, his eyes softening briefly, despite the tension in his voice. Come on, careful on the stairs. They were 3 blocks from the safe house Nate maintained on the outskirts of the city, a modest, unremarkable property registered under a name that traced back through nothing recognizable, when a pair of headlights appeared in the rear view mirror, holding steady at a distance that felt within a few minutes deliberately unnatural. Petey, I see them. His voice had gone flat and controlled the tone of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of moment more times than he cared to admit. Hold on to something. He took the next turn sharply, tires briefly protesting against the wet pavement, and the trailing car matched the maneuver without hesitation, closing the distance rather than falling back. They're not trying to hide anymore, Petey said grimly, reaching for his phone one-handed. Nate, we've got company. Heading toward the river road. Grace gripped the door handle, one hand instinctively pressed against her belly, fear rising cold and sharp through her chest even as she forced her breathing to stay steady. Petey, the baby I know. I've got you. Just hold on. The pursuing car surged forward, drawing level for a brief, terrifying moment, before swerving hard into their lane, forcing Petey to wrench the wheel sideways to avoid a collision that would have ended everything in an instant. The car fishtailed tires, screaming against wet asphalt, before Petey regained control, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, sweat beading at his temple, despite the cold night air pouring through a window cracked in the chaos. Hold on, he said again, quieter this time, almost a prayer. Nate arrived at the river road less than 4 minutes later, having broken every reasonable speed limit across town. The moment Petey's call came through Emily Hart in the passenger seat beside him, she had been 3 streets from her, duplex on her way to drop the verified documents at an Everone and Dice independent journalist's office when his call reached her, and she had not hesitated for even a second before redirecting him toward the danger instead of away from it. You didn't have to come, Nate said, glancing sideways as he took a curve too fast. Grace didn't do anything to deserve this, Emily said, her voice tight but resolute, gripping the door handle as the car surged forward. Whatever's unresolved between us that hasn't changed. They reached the river road just as the pursuing vehicle attempted a second more aggressive maneuver, forcing Petey's car toward the guardrail, overlooking the dark, rushing water below. Nate's headlights swept across the scene an instant before impact, Petey wrenching the wheel, hard right tires catching gravel at the shoulder, the pursuing car's driver overcorrecting at the sudden change and slamming instead into the guardrail itself, metal shrieking against metal in a shower of sparks that lit the night for one blinding second. Nate brought his own car to a hard stop, throwing it into park before the wheels had fully settled already, moving toward Petey's vehicle with Emily close behind him. Grace Nate wrenched the passenger door open, his hands shaking as he found her conscious, terrified but unharmed, one arm braced protectively across her belly. Are you hurt? Is the baby? I'm okay. I think we're okay. Grace's voice trembled but held steady, her eyes finding his with fierce, unshaken clarity despite everything. Petey got us out. He saved us. Petey climbed out of the driver's seat more slowly, one hand pressed to a shallow cut above his eyebrow, his usual dry composure cracking just slightly at the edges. Remind me to bill Whitmore for the paint job. A car door slammed somewhere behind them, and a man Nate did not recognize, young, wiry, clearly rattled by the crash, stumbled out of the wrecked pursuing vehicle and bolted into the tree line along the riverbank before anyone could react. Let him go, Nate said, his voice hard. We know exactly who sent him. They gathered at Nate's safe house an hour later, adrenaline slowly giving way to the particular exhaustion that follows real fear. Grace wrapped in a blanket on the sofa with Emily seated beside her, checking her pulse with the careful, practiced attentiveness of someone who had clearly done this before under circumstances just as frightening. Petey sat across the room, an ice pack pressed to his temple, methodically working through his phone despite the visible tremor still in his hands. "I traced the plates already," he said. "Registered to a shell company 2 layers removed from Whitmore Holdings, same pattern as the payments to Jake Everett. He's not even trying to hide it well anymore. That tells me he's desperate, not careful. Desperate men do reckless things," Nate said quietly, standing near the window watching the dark tree line beyond the property line, as though he expected another threat to emerge from it at any moment. "Which means he'll try again unless we move faster than he expects us to." "Nate." Emily looked up from Grace's side, something firm and clear in her expression despite everything unresolved between them. "I know what you're capable of. I know what resources sit at your disposal that most people investigating a case like this will never have access to. I need to hear you say out loud right now that whatever you're planning doesn't end with something happening to Warren Whitmore that a courtroom will never get the chance to judge." The room went very quiet. Petey looked up from his phone, watching Nate carefully, the question hanging heavy in the air between all of them. Nate turned from the window slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the cold, controlled fury. Petey had glimpsed briefly the morning they'd first confirmed Whitmore's signature on the guardianship documents. "I spent tonight watching a car try to run my sister off a highway, pregnant, terrified, because a man decided protecting his fortune mattered more than her life or her child's," he said. "There is a part of me, the part my uncle spent years cultivating, that knows exactly how to make a problem like Warren Whitmore disappear quietly, permanently, with no trial and no consequences traced back to anyone in this room." He let the silence sit for a moment, heavy and honest. "I'm not going to do that," he continued. "Not because I don't want to. God help me, some part of me wants to very badly right now. But my mother didn't raise a man who solves injustice by becoming the thing that caused it, and Martha didn't raise Grace to believe violence answers what the truth is supposed to answer instead. Warren Whitmore is going to answer for every single thing he's done, the trust he stole, the family he destroyed tonight in front of a judge, in front of cameras, in front of the entire city he spent 2 decades quietly controlling. Publicly, completely. That's the only justice I'm interested in delivering." Emily studied him for a long moment, something in her expression finally cautiously beginning to loosen. "That's the first thing you've said tonight that actually sounds like the man I thought I was starting to fall for." "Is it enough?" Nate asked quietly. "It's a start," Emily said. "A real one." Grace, still wrapped in her blanket, reached out and took her brother's hand as he crossed the room to sit beside her, exhaustion and relief, and something like fragile hope all moving across her face at once. "Whatever happens next," she said, "we finish this together. All of us." Petey raised his ice pack in a tired, wry salute. "All of us. Preferably somewhere with fewer guardrails involved next time." Outside, the last of the adrenaline slowly drained from the room, replaced by something steadier. 4 people bound now by grief and danger, and an unlikely hard-won loyalty preparing for the final reckoning that all of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, was now only days away. The arrest happened on a gray Tuesday morning, quietly, without the theatrics Warren Whitmore had spent 2 decades avoiding. Federal agents working from the evidence Nate's team had assembled alongside Loretta Combs's sworn testimony, and the financial trail Petey had spent weeks reconstructing, arrived at Whitmore Holdings just after 9 o'clock, and escorted him out through the same marble lobby where he had once shaken hands with senators and mayors, past employees who stood frozen at their desks watching 2 decades of quiet, careful power collapse in the space of a single elevator ride. Loretta had testified 2 days earlier, her voice steady, despite 71 years of accumulated fear, laying out every detail of the night. She had falsified a healthy infant's discharge paperwork under threat and bribery. Both. Daisy Kowalski, too, had finally come forward on her own, tearfully recanting her original statement about the necklace, confessing that Chelsea Whitmore had pressured her into the false testimony months earlier, promising a promotion that never materialized, threatening her job when Daisy hesitated. The necklace itself, it turned out, had never been stolen at all, only misplaced behind a dresser exactly where Warren had once, in a rare, unguarded moment, suggested it might be found. The trust, Ruth Calder, had once been entitled to swollen over 23 years into a fortune worth considerably more than the modest inheritance it had started as was ordered, returned to the Calder family in full pending final resolution of Whitmore's criminal proceedings. But it was the final piece of evidence uncovered almost by accident during the forensic accounting of Whitmore's private records that changed everything none of them had thought to question. A monthly payment routed for over 2 decades, through an account registered to a care facility in rural Iowa under a name none of them recognized. Petey found it first staring at the ledger entry for a long moment, before calling Nate with a question rather than an answer. "Nate, I need you to look at something. I don't think your mother died the way you were told." The facility sat at the end of a quiet gravel road outside a small Iowa town, a modest, well-kept building surrounded by gardens that someone clearly tended with real care. Nate stood outside the front doors for nearly 10 minutes before he could make himself walk through them. Grace's hand gripped tightly in his own, Petey and Emily a step behind all four of them, united in an anticipation too enormous to put into words. A staff member led them down a quiet hallway to a small sitting room where an older woman sat by a window, gray-haired. Now her face lined with years neither of her children had been present to witness, but unmistakably, achingly familiar. In the particular curve of her eyes, the same eyes Grace had, the same eyes Nate had glimpsed in the mirror his entire life without ever knowing where they had truly come from. "Ruth Calder," the staff member said gently. "You have visitors." The woman turned, confusion crossing her face. At first, decades of medication and isolation had blurred certain memories. The staff had warned them, though her mind remained largely intact, and then slowly something in her expression shifted as her eyes moved from Nate's face to Grace's and back again. "My babies," she whispered, her hand rising to her mouth, tears spilling freely down a face that had waited 23 years for exactly this moment. "My babies, is it really you?" Warren Whitmore, faced with the full weight of federal charges and the collapse of everything he had built, had finally confessed the last piece of his crime. In exchange for a marginally reduced sentence, Ruth Calder had never died. In the chaos and devastation following what she believed was the loss of one newborn daughter, weakened by a difficult delivery and manipulated by a man she had trusted to manage her family's affairs, she had been quietly committed to psychiatric care under a diagnosis. Whitmore had helped orchestrate, deemed falsely incapable of caring for her surviving son, who was placed instead with her brother. Decades of careful, deliberate isolation had followed, funded quietly through the very trust that should have belonged to her children, ensuring she remained forever unable to challenge the theft of her own inheritance or her own family. The reunion that followed in that small Iowa sitting room held nothing. Performed about it only 3 people bound by blood and by decades of stolen time, weeping together in a way that needed no witnesses to be real. Nate knelt beside his mother's chair, his composure so carefully maintained through every crisis of the past weeks, finally breaking completely as he pressed his forehead against her hand. Grace knelt on her other side, one hand resting protectively over her own belly. Introducing the grandchild, Ruth would meet within the month to a grandmother she had never known existed until that very afternoon. Grace gave birth 3 weeks later on a quiet autumn evening to a healthy baby boy she named Martin, after the mother who had raised her with nothing but love and honesty despite the secret she carried. Ruth held her grandson for the first time in a hospital room crowded with more family than any of them had believed possible. Only months earlier, Nate Petey, leaning against the doorframe with his usual dry commentary, softened into something closer to open affection, and Emily Hart, seated quietly beside Grace's bed, her hand finding Nate's without either of them needing to discuss what it meant. It was there in that crowded, joyful hospital room that Nate finally said aloud what he had spent weeks working up the courage to admit. "I spent my whole life believing that love had to be earned through protection," he told Emily, quietly away from the others. "That the only way I deserved to matter to anyone was by being useful to them, powerful for them, capable of fixing whatever the world broke. My mother taught me that without meaning to, just by how hard she had to work to keep us both alive. I built an entire life around it, the company, the other world beneath it, all of it in service of being needed." He paused, something raw and unguarded in his voice. "You never needed any of that from me, Emily. You needed the truth plainly, even when it cost me everything to give it to you. And somehow that taught me more about what it actually means to be loved than 20 years of being useful ever did." "I'm still learning how to trust it," Emily admitted softly. "But I'm here. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Nate said, and meant it completely. Warren Whitmore was sentenced the following spring to a substantial term in federal prison, the last of his stolen empire dismantled and redistributed to the family he had spent 2 decades quietly destroying. Nate formally dissolved the organization his uncle had left him, converting its remaining legitimate assets into a foundation dedicated to supporting single mothers, wrongly accused workers, and families torn apart by exactly the kind of quiet, systemic cruelty that had once nearly cost him his own. Grace often said in the years that followed that the greatest lesson her life had taught her was this: that the people who raise us with love are our family, regardless of blood, and the truth, however long it takes to surface, always eventually finds its way home. Nate learned something quieter but no less important. That strength built entirely around protecting others eventually needs someone brave enough to walk in and simply love the man underneath it, without requiring him to earn it first. If there is one thing this story leaves behind for anyone watching it, is this: never let a difficult season convince you that you are unworthy of love or unworthy of the truth. Kindness offered without expectation has a way of finding its way back, often from the most unexpected places. And the family we choose to protect and forgive can matter every bit as much as the family we are born into. Compassion, responsibility, and the courage to tell the truth even when it costs us something real. These are the threads that hold a broken family back together, and they are available to every single one of us in ways large and small every single day. What lesson did you take away from this story? We would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment right below this video and let us know. And if this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, leave a comment with your own reflections, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you again in the next video.